This is a help video for question number 2 on your acceleration lesson assignment. How will I find acceleration for my questions on my assignment? We have 2 steps to calculate the acceleration. Step 1, find the change in velocity. We always find the change in velocity with ending velocity minus starting velocity. We must make sure we use the correct order to get the correct sign for acceleration. Once we get our change in velocity, we go to step 2. Over what time? How long does it take in terms of time for that change in velocity to occur? Acceleration equals that change in velocity divided by time. Question number 2 is about the second part of the race. You cross the finish line at your top speed and then gradually slow down, eventually stopping. Question number 2, we will calculate acceleration for the last part of our race. After you cross the finish line, you slow down and come to a stop, breathing hard. It takes you 10 seconds to come to a stop. What is your acceleration? Well, our first step is to calculate the change in velocity. Before we can calculate change in velocity, we have to identify and determine starting velocity and ending velocity. Remember, we're thinking about that last part of the race, not the entire race here for question number 2. So our starting velocity is the velocity or speed we have when we cross the finish line. We cross the finish line at our max sprinting speed. Our starting velocity is 5.4 meters per second. Then we gradually slow down, eventually coming to a stop. When we are stopped, what is our velocity? What is our speed? Well, at a stop, our velocity is 0 meters per second. For the second part of the race, our starting velocity is 5.4 meters per second, and our ending velocity is 0 meters per second. Now we can calculate change in velocity. To calculate change in velocity, we have our ending velocity minus our starting velocity. Our ending velocity is 0, and our starting velocity is 5.4 meters per second. 0 minus 5.4 is negative 5.4 meters per second. That is why it is so important to make sure we get the correct starting and ending, and we set it up ending minus starting. Our change in velocity is negative 5.4 meters per second. Before we go a step farther, we should pause for a moment and ask ourselves, a negative change in velocity. Does this make sense for this part of the race? Your answer should always make sense. Well, if we have a negative velocity, that means our speed is decreasing. In this part of the race, is our speed decreasing? are we slowing down? This part of the race is from crossing the finish line to slowing down and coming to a stop. In this part of the race, our speed is decreasing and a negative change in velocity makes sense. The next step to calculate acceleration is step 2. Over what time? Take our change in velocity and divide it by the time it takes for the velocity to change. So step 2 is over what time? We need to determine the time. After you cross the finish line, you slow down and come to a stop. Breathing hard. It takes you 10 seconds to come to a stop. What is your acceleration? Our time is 10 seconds for this part of the race. This part of the race takes 10 seconds. To get acceleration, we take our change in velocity, which is negative 5.4 meters per second, and we divide it by time. Minus 5.4 divided by 10 equals minus 0.54, and the unit is meters per second squared. The units for acceleration are always distance over time squared. Does this answer make sense? Our answers should always make sense. Well, what's going on with negative acceleration? Does negative acceleration make sense here? Well, we should be slowing down if there's negative acceleration. Are we slowing down in this part of the race? Yes, we are. So acceleration is negative in this part of the race. A positive acceleration value would not allow us to slow down to a stop. We used 2 steps to calculate acceleration.